intimacy and maybe the gift of having animals in terms of breaking through some of those barriers. And I was going to ask you, Chris, if you have come across some of the research I know I've come across in terms of you know, being with animals does everything from lower our blood pressure to work with depression, and I thought I'd ask you about that.
Right. You're right. There's been a lot of research done, and actually more research is being done now because people are beginning to recognize the real benefit of animals in the lives of people. But there's been terrific strides that have been made with the clinically depressed, with handicapped individuals, with the elderly. A lot of that is felt that the reason that animals help, particularly people in those categories, is because of touch. Okay. That when we earlier were talking about intimacy, but one of the things that culturally happens in our environment is that touch usually is unacceptable. It wouldn't be acceptable for me, because I don't really know you that well, to come up to you and touch you or to hug you. But we both know how good that would feel if we could do that. But animals, there isn't that barrier there. Animals allow that. And so that sense of touch allows for a lot of these folks to break those barriers that exist and help the healing process.
Well, and not only that, but I think at a neurotransmitter level, I mean, the whole idea of being with a purring pet, and I believe they've done studies with just stroking the fur, you know, can just bring your, they've done research where they'll have somebody sitting in a chair and they'll be approached by a physician and they're measuring the blood pressure and it goes way up, and a pet comes in and immediately not only does it go down, but it goes down lower than when they were just sitting by themselves. So there's some implications there for not just our mental health but our physical health in terms of I guess stress reduction.
Yes.
Until, of course, and you mentioned before, the idea of pouring our hearts into animals, and then inevitably we will lose them. I mean, most of us do not outlive our, I mean, most of us do outlive our pets. And, and that's the ambivalence I've heard people say, where maybe they've had a good experience with a pet, and they love the pet dearly, and at some level they're afraid of committing their hearts to another animal and having to go through that loss again. And I'm sure you must see that in your work.
We see that all the time. In fact, one of the programs that we offer as part of the Humane Society is a pet loss program for people who are grieving over the loss of their pets. What we recognize is that losing a pet is a loss. There is a grieving process that all of us have to go through, and it's important to allow people to do that. Most people, once they've had an opportunity to go through that grieving process, usually do again want to reach out and love another pet. It's hard to sort of stand back and not have that back in your life again.
That's right. Well, and also, culturally, I know we've talked about grief on this program more than once, and the idea that as a culture, we don't have a lot of tolerance for grief in general, and so I think it's even harder sometimes for people to have their grief for their pets taken seriously. It's sort of like, well, just go get a new one. Go down, and where we wouldn't think, well, just replace your child or replace your friend, we somehow see some people will sometimes talk about pets as though they're interchangeable. And my experience, I know of my Nikki, is that there isn't another one. I mean, it wouldn't be like going down and just getting another Nicholas. I mean, that just wouldn't happen.
Some people feel embarrassed to admit that they're grieving for their pets, and they need permission to do that. Someone might say to me, I know you'll understand this. I can tell you. And then they describe their sadness about the loss of their pet, as if somebody else who wasn't oriented to pets might not understand, and that they would be embarrassed maybe with somebody else.
That's a good point. Actually, this is a good time for me to interject that. We are coming up on Halloween. In fact, this show will be airing on Halloween night. And so for those of you who do have pets, like my Nicholas is completely black, he's a black cat, or white cats, I believe you've put out an announcement at the Humane Society to be of special care with our pets over the next week or so.
Yes, yes. Unfortunately, the Halloween season, or the Halloween time, there is a lot of ritual around, Halloween, and unfortunately there is some negative ritual around that. Typically, what we see at the Humane Society is during the Halloween period is many black cats go missing and are never found. Many white cats go missing and are never found. There's high suspicion that these cats are being taken and used in, unfortunately, for situations like satanic rituals, or being tortured. It's a sad thing in our society to have to admit that, but unfortunately it does go on. And we, ask people that, if you have your cats, in general, your pets should be kept indoors on Halloween, but particularly white cats and black cats, because they're particularly subject to, problems.
Right, right. Yeah, you're right. I mean, that is a difficult thing to have to admit about our culture, where there's so, on the one hand, there is such an entity as Humane Society.
Yes.
Right? I mean, we care enough about animals to have these kinds of organizations. Obviously, it's something that's not culture-wide, but there are small sects. In fact, one of my things I remember from graduate school or early psych studies was we studied the history of child abuse, and in fact, the very first reported case of child abuse was reported through the Humane Society.
Yes.
That in our country, we had Humane Society for pets before we had any kind of children's protective services, which I think is interesting in terms of how people have bonded with their animals before they did their children.
Yes, yes.
Quite a statement about the role of animals in our lives.
Yes, yes.
That goes way, way back. I recently read about finding the remains of a skeleton that was estimated to be 12,000 years old. This was in Israel. And the skeleton was holding a puppy. And it seemed pretty clear from the way that the remains were found that this puppy was a pet rather than prey, being used as food, for instance, at that time. And that was astonishing to me, that it goes, that our relationship with animals goes back that far.
Well, some of the theories is that, basically we're all from originally about the same kingdom, and then we just sort of evolved over time. That's one of the thoughts. And the other thought is, again, that sort of chemistry that the animals around us can provide an aspect of love and companionship that people just cannot replicate. In terms of pets and small children, what's your, sometimes people will say things like, well, I'm afraid to get a cat because I have a baby and the cat will smother the baby. And somebody was asking me the other day the origins of that system. Is that a real threat to people, or is that just a kind of a myth?
It's really more myth than it is. I think where that started is that, cats like to gravitate to warm places, and I think all of us who have cats have known that sometimes at night they'll snuggle up, next to your neck, and, we all kind of like that. Well, with a large cat and a small child, that could be, I wouldn't say that it would smother the baby, but it could be interpreted as, oh my gosh, the baby could be in distress if the cat stayed there too long.
Okay.
But what we do at the Humane Society is that we really work together with people who are interested in adopting animals to make certain that they find the right pet for their household. And many times, a kitten or a puppy isn't the right pet for a household that has a lot of small children. Because mom and dad don't have time for making certain that that puppy or kitten gets trained, and also because they're smaller, they're more vulnerable to smaller hands.
Indeed, I know when my little godchildren come to visit.
Yes.
There's lots of petting the cat like this,
Yes.
and I'm having to sort of remove Kitty from the little tiny hands. Yeah.
Right.
Rabbits are pets that often are not ideal for families with young children, yet they're really very appealing because they're so sweet and they're not noisy, you see.
True.
And when people ask me, I have rabbits, and when people ask me about rabbits as a pet for children, if the children are very young, I kind of push them away from that at the moment. I ask them maybe to consider waiting until the children are a little bit older, because rabbits are very, very tender. If a kid picks them up by the ear, the rabbit's spine can snap, and things that people who have never had a rabbit haven't learned yet. So I think sometimes caution with
yeah,
very young children.
Something a little more sturdy, perhaps, or can get away faster.
Right,
Yes,
right,
yes,
right.
yes.
Now,
Yes.
what about the role of animals in relationships? Now, I'm sure you must have situations where two people's eyes lock across the room and it's instant chemistry until he or she comes over for the first time and meets Fido, and then there begins to be a problem. Do you have people coming in with that experience, which is, what do we do?
Yes, all the time, and it can cause problems in relationships, particularly if, you know, one or the other doesn't like dogs or cats or whatever. That probably is the second reason, most prevalent reason why we get animals turned in at the Humane Society, is that my boyfriend doesn't like my dog, or, you know, my husband doesn't like the cat. What I'll also say is that typically, if that happens within a relationship, that's usually a red flag that there's going to be other problems later down the line, because if, you know, a pet is if my pets are very important to me, and if I were to choose to give them up for a relationship, I think there would be some resentment there over the long term, and it's just a matter of time before that kicks in and comes up in other ways.
Absolutely, absolutely. I know I was dating someone who had an allergy to kitty cats, and that was a problem in the sense that, you know, Nicholas wasn't going anywhere. So
Right.
he was either going to have to get some Celdane, or this wasn't going to work. We're going to go ahead and close, and as we close, we're going to see a last clip of a student who was willing to share her experience with her pet ferret, which I thought was an interesting choice. I want to thank you both for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
And
Thank you very much.
bringing Jezebel to join us. Thank you for being here, and join us next week as we learn about breast cancer recovery. Take care.
I like to have lots of animals. I've had lots of different kinds, and usually there's something, you know, that I can nurture and fuss over without crossing into someone else's boundaries. But I had one pet one time that did the same for me. I became really ill, and I had a ferret. And I was pretty much bedridden for about a month. And my husband got me a big box of raisins, and I spent an entire month training him to do tricks. And so he kind of adjusted to me, and he spent the entire time within about 3 feet of me. He stayed with me the entire time, kept me sane, because it gets really boring, and it's really frustrating, and it can be really scary. And it gave me something to focus on besides myself and how I was feeling. So that experience, instead of me taking care of something else, it took care of me. So it was really great.
Thank you for sharing that.